What would you do if someone looked at your clothes, laughed at your shoes, questioned your bank account in front of an entire room full of strangers, and had absolutely no idea you were richer than everyone around them combined? And what if the person humiliating you wasn't just rude, but so arrogant that he bet his entire career on the belief that you were worthless? Tonight's story isn't just about money. It's about power. The kind of power that stays quiet while people expose who they really are. And trust me, by the end of this story, the final decision this woman makes will leave you speechless. So stay with me, because the ending changes everything. Rain hammered against the streets of downtown Chicago like the city itself was trying to wash something away. Luxury cars slid through wet intersections beneath glowing towers while wealthy shoppers hurried between restaurants, hotels, and designer boutiques carrying bags worth more than most people's monthly rent. It was the kind of night where appearances mattered. The kind of night where people judged each other before saying a single word. And inside one of the most expensive luxury fashion stores in the city, appearances mattered more than anywhere else. The store was called Laurent Etoile. Soft golden lighting reflected against marble floors while instrumental piano music floated through the air. Handbags sat inside glass displays like museum pieces. Watches sparkled beneath diamond white lights. Every employee inside the store had been trained to recognize wealth within seconds. Shoes, watches, posture, jewelry, accent. They studied people the way gamblers studied cards. And standing at the center of that world was the store manager, Richard Calloway. Richard believed he understood people instantly. After 15 years in luxury retail, he thought he could identify status with one glance. Wealthy customers received warm smiles, private champagne, and personal attention. Everyone else received polite dismissal wrapped in fake professionalism. But Richard's greatest weakness was something he mistook for intelligence. He believed appearances never lied. At exactly 7:42 p.m., the front doors opened quietly. A woman stepped inside alone. At first, nobody rushed toward her. In fact, most employees barely looked up. She wore a dark raincoat damp from the storm outside. Her shoes were simple. Her hair was tied back neatly, but without extravagance. No visible jewelry. No designer logos. No expensive purse dangling from her arm. To most people inside Laurent Etoile, she looked invisible. The woman paused near the entrance for a moment while rainwater dripped softly from her coat sleeves onto the marble floor. Her eyes moved slowly across the store, calm and observant, taking in every detail without hurry. Her name was Vanessa Cole. And the strange thing about Vanessa wasn't that she looked ordinary. It was how comfortable she seemed being underestimated. An employee near the fragrance counter glanced toward another worker and quietly smirked. "She's definitely in the wrong place," the girl whispered. Another employee laughed softly. "Probably just here to warm up from the rain." Neither realized Vanessa had heard every word. But Vanessa gave no reaction at all. She simply continued walking deeper into the store with calm, measured steps. Near the center showroom, Richard finally noticed her. His eyes moved quickly across her clothes, her shoes, her lack of visible status symbols. Within seconds, he had already decided exactly who she was. Or more importantly, who she wasn't. Richard adjusted his suit jacket before approaching her with the polished smile he reserved for people he considered inconveniences instead of opportunities. "Good evening," he said. Smoothly. "Can I help you find something within a comfortable price range?" The question sounded polite on the surface. But underneath it was something sharp. Something intentional. Vanessa looked at him quietly for a second before answering. "I'm just looking around." Her voice was calm, educated, controlled. Richard noticed that immediately, though he ignored the strange feeling it gave him. "Of course," he replied. "We do ask guests to be mindful while browsing. Some items here are exceptionally valuable." There it was again, that subtle insult disguised as professionalism. Vanessa's eyes drifted toward a handbag displayed beneath glass nearby. "How much is that one?" she asked. Richard glanced toward it casually. $38,000. He expected surprise, maybe embarrassment, maybe the awkward apology of someone realizing they had entered a world they couldn't afford. Instead, Vanessa simply nodded thoughtfully. Interesting. That answer unsettled him slightly. Because she didn't react the way people usually did. Richard forced another smile. Most of our clientele schedule private appointments before viewing premium collections. Vanessa turned toward him fully now. And if someone doesn't schedule an appointment? Richard's smile tightened slightly. Then we usually assume they're browsing recreationally. Again, Vanessa gave almost no reaction. But something about her silence was beginning to irritate him. Because Richard was used to controlling conversations. And this woman wasn't behaving correctly. She wasn't intimidated. She wasn't defensive. She was simply watching him. Carefully. Across the showroom, a younger employee named Elena had started paying attention now. Unlike the others, she noticed small details most people ignored. Vanessa's posture, her composure, the way she looked directly at people without needing approval from them. Elena suddenly had the uncomfortable feeling that something about this situation was very wrong. Meanwhile, Richard continued speaking. If you'd like, I can direct you toward some of our seasonal discount collections. There it was, the first open insult. A nearby customer glanced over after hearing it. Then another. The atmosphere inside the store shifted slightly. Vanessa slowly looked around the showroom before returning her attention to Richard. Do you always decide what people can afford before they speak? She asked softly. Richard laughed lightly, though there was arrogance behind it now. Experience usually makes those decisions for me. Vanessa studied him for another quiet moment. Then she smiled. Not emotionally, not warmly, just knowingly. And somehow, that smile made Richard unexpectedly uncomfortable. Because for the first time since she entered the store, he had the strange feeling he was the one being evaluated. But he ignored the feeling quickly. After all, in Richard Calloway's world, wealthy people looked wealthy. And this woman standing in front of him looked like someone the rain had simply carried in from the street. He had no idea that within the next few hours, his entire life was about to collapse inside the very store he thought he controlled. And Vanessa Cole still hadn't even begun to show him who she really was. With that said, thanks for watching and until next time. Vanessa Cole continued walking through Laurent Etoile as though Richard's insults had never happened. Her calmness unsettled him more with every passing second. Most people reacted when they were embarrassed. They became defensive, angry, awkward, or eager to prove themselves. But Vanessa moved through the showroom with the same quiet composure she had carried in from the rain. And that composure was beginning to attract attention. Customers nearby had noticed the exchange. Employees pretended to organize displays while secretly listening. Even Elena, the younger sales associate near the fragrance counter, kept glancing toward Vanessa with growing curiosity. Richard hated losing control of a room. So he decided to regain it. He followed Vanessa toward the premium accessories section, his polished shoes tapping sharply against the marble floor. You know, he said loudly enough for nearby customers to hear, our collector's pieces are usually reserved for established clients. Vanessa stopped beside a glass display containing luxury watches. And what qualifies someone as established? She asked calmly. Richard smiled thinly. History, reputation, financial profile. Interesting, Vanessa replied softly. So you study people before respecting them. A few customers exchanged looks after hearing that. Richard noticed. His ego tightened immediately. No, he answered carefully, though irritation was creeping into his voice now. We simply provide service appropriate to the customer. Vanessa turned toward him slowly. And who decides what's appropriate? For the first time, Richard felt himself becoming defensive instead of dominant. But arrogance is dangerous because it often doubles down instead of retreating. He gestured casually toward the display cases surrounding them. People don't come into stores like this accidentally. Vanessa's eyes narrowed almost invisibly. Stores like this. Richard gave a short laugh. Luxury environments require a certain level of familiarity. There it was again. That coded language. That carefully disguised cruelty wealthy industries often perfected. Not direct enough to cause outrage, but sharp enough to humiliate. And Richard was enjoying it now. Because several customers had begun quietly watching the interaction. He could feel their attention feeding his confidence. In his mind, Vanessa had become entertainment. A distraction from the slow evening rain outside. But Vanessa still refused to react emotionally. Instead, she asked another simple question. How long have you worked here? Richard blinked slightly, caught off guard. 15 years. And in 15 years, Vanessa asked softly, you've never misjudged anyone? Richard smirked confidently. Not once. That answer made Elena look down immediately. Because even she knew that wasn't true. Richard misjudged people constantly. Employees, customers, anyone he viewed as beneath him. But nobody challenged him openly because Richard had power inside the store. He controlled schedules, promotions, recommendations, and careers. Younger employees learned quickly that surviving under Richard meant staying quiet. Vanessa, however, seemed completely untouched by his authority. She moved toward another display containing limited edition handbags while Richard followed closely beside her. That collection starts at $50,000, he said. Vanessa glanced at the bag casually. Does it? Yes, Richard replied. Though honestly, it's more of an investment piece than something practical. Vanessa nodded slowly. And yet it's still just leather and stitching. One customer nearby laughed softly after hearing that. Richard's jaw tightened. Because suddenly the conversation no longer felt one-sided. Vanessa wasn't fighting him emotionally. She was dismantling him quietly. And that made him reckless. Well, Richard said, forcing a smile, some people appreciate craftsmanship. Others simply see price tags. Vanessa looked directly into his eyes now. And some people, she replied calmly, confuse price with value. Silence. A sharp silence. Even the nearby customers stopped pretending not to. Listen. Richard felt heat rise in his face. He was losing control again. And worse. This woman was making him feel small without ever raising her voice. That realization triggered something ugly inside him. Pride mixed with humiliation. The most dangerous combination. He straightened his tie before speaking louder this time. Perhaps, he said, you'd feel more comfortable somewhere less exclusive. The room grew still. Elena's stomach dropped immediately. Because that wasn't subtle anymore. That was public humiliation. Vanessa remained motionless for a moment. Then she asked quietly, do I make you uncomfortable, Richard? Hearing his name from her lips startled him slightly. How do you know my name? Vanessa glanced toward the gold manager badge pinned to his suit. You seem like someone who enjoys being recognized. A couple near the watches tried to hide smiles. Richard noticed, and embarrassment finally turned into hostility. He crossed his arms. You know what? Let's stop pretending. These items are far beyond your budget, and wasting everyone's time isn't appropriate. There it was. No professionalism left now. Just cruelty. Open and direct. Elena looked horrified. Even a few customers appeared uncomfortable now. But Vanessa simply stared at him quietly. No anger. No panic. No shame. And somehow that silence made Richard feel even more exposed. Why are you smiling? He snapped suddenly. Vanessa's expression barely changed. Because you still think this conversation is about money. Richard laughed sarcastically. Isn't it? No, Vanessa answered softly. It's about character. That sentence hit harder than Richard expected. For a split second, uncertainty flickered through him. But then his pride returned stronger than before. He gestured dramatically toward the center display platform where the most expensive item in the store rested beneath soft spotlighting, a custom diamond-encrusted handbag flown in from Paris for private collectors. That piece, Richard announced loudly, "costs more than most people earn in years." The attention of the entire showroom shifted toward them now. Customers stopped browsing completely. Employees froze. Even the piano music suddenly felt tense. Richard looked directly at Vanessa with a smirk filled with absolute certainty. Then he said the sentence that would destroy him. "If you can afford this," he said slowly, "I'll quit." The showroom fell silent. Completely silent. Alina's heart began pounding. Several customers stared openly now. And Vanessa Cole simply looked at the handbag for a long moment before turning back toward Richard. Then, for the first time since entering the store, she smiled in a way that made the entire room uneasy. Because it wasn't the smile of someone embarrassed. It was the smile of someone who had just been given exactly what they were waiting for. For several long seconds, nobody inside Laurent Etoile moved. The showroom remained frozen beneath soft golden lights while rain battered the glass windows outside. Richard Calloway stood confidently near the center display, arms crossed, completely convinced he had already won. In his mind, the situation was simple. A poorly dressed woman had wandered into a luxury store pretending to belong there, and now she had finally been cornered. But what Richard didn't understand was that Vanessa Cole had stopped thinking about handbags several minutes ago. Now she was studying people. The employees. The customers, the silence, the fear hiding behind polite smiles. And most importantly, him. Vanessa looked once more at the diamond-encrusted handbag beneath the display lights. It shimmered like a trophy designed for people desperate to prove something to the world. Then she asked calmly, "You would really quit?" Richard laughed lightly, enjoying the attention surrounding them now. "If you can buy that bag tonight, I'll hand in my resignation myself." A nervous chuckle escaped from somewhere near the fragrance section. Elena didn't laugh. Something deep in her instincts was screaming that Richard had made a terrible mistake. Vanessa tilted her head slightly. "And you're certain about this?" Richard spread his arms confidently. "Completely." Vanessa nodded once. Then she reached into the pocket of her raincoat. The movement itself was small. But suddenly every eye inside the store followed it. Richard expected embarrassment, maybe a declined credit card, maybe an excuse about transferring funds. He had seen wealthy fantasies collapse many times before. But Vanessa simply removed her phone. Nothing flashy. No designer case. No dramatic reaction. She looked at the screen briefly before dialing a number from memory. Richard smirked immediately, calling someone for help. A few customers laughed quietly. Vanessa ignored them. The phone rang once. Then someone answered. Her voice remained calm. "Good evening, Marcus. I need a favor." The moment she said the name, something shifted in Alina's expression. Marcus. Why did that sound familiar? Meanwhile, Richard leaned casually against the display counter, fully committed to humiliating her publicly now. "You know," he said loudly, "we do accept payment plans in some circumstances." More uncomfortable laughter followed. Vanessa continued speaking into the phone as though he didn't exist. "I'm at the Chicago Laurent Etoile location," she said quietly. "Yes, right now." A pause. Then something subtle changed in her tone. "Actually, I think you should come personally." Richard rolled his eyes dramatically. "Of course," he muttered sarcastically. "Now executives are coming." Vanessa ended the call calmly and slipped the phone back into her coat pocket. Then she simply stood there, waiting. That unsettled Richard more than he wanted to admit. Because people bluffing usually overexplained themselves. They became nervous, defensive, desperate to be believed. Vanessa looked none of those things. She looked patient, as though she already knew exactly how the night would end. Richard forced another laugh to hide his growing irritation. "Well, are we waiting for your accountant?" Vanessa's eyes met his again. "No," she answered softly. "We're waiting for yours." The sentence landed strangely. Several customers exchanged confused looks. Richard frowned. "Excuse me." But Vanessa gave no further explanation. Minutes passed slowly after that. And with every passing second, the atmosphere inside the showroom grew heavier. Employees whispered quietly. Customers pretended to browse while secretly staying to watch. Even the music overhead suddenly felt distant. Then Elena noticed something outside. Black vehicles had begun pulling up near the entrance. Not luxury shoppers. Professional vehicles. Dark-tinted windows. Security drivers. Her stomach tightened immediately. Richard noticed too, though he quickly dismissed the feeling rising inside him. Probably wealthy clients, he told himself. Nothing more. But then the front doors opened. And 3 people entered the store wearing dark tailored coats still damp from the rain. The moment Elena saw the man walking in front, her entire face changed, because she recognized him instantly. Marcus Reed, Chief Financial Officer of Laurent Global Holdings. One of the most powerful executives in the entire luxury corporation. Elena's heart nearly stopped. Richard noticed her expression immediately. "What's wrong with you?" he whispered sharply. But Elena couldn't answer. Because Marcus Reed wasn't casually visiting a retail store during a thunderstorm. And he definitely wasn't walking directly toward Vanessa Cole. The showroom atmosphere changed instantly as employees straightened nervously. Customers moved aside instinctively. Even Richard's confidence flickered slightly now. Marcus walked across the marble floor without hesitation. Then stopped directly in front of Vanessa. And to Richard's absolute confusion, the billionaire executive lowered his head respectfully. "Ms. Cole," he said carefully. "I came as quickly as I could." The entire showroom went silent again. Not curious silence, stunned silence. Richard blinked once, then again, because his brain suddenly refused to process what he had just heard. "Ms. Cole, not, ma'am, not, customer, not, miss." The tone Marcus used carried something else entirely. Respect. Real respect. Vanessa gave a small nod. "Thank you for coming, Marcus." Marcus glanced around the showroom slowly. His expression darkened almost immediately as he noticed the tension in the room, the gathered customers, the nervous employees. Then his eyes landed on Richard. And everything changed. The CFO's face hardened instantly. "What happened here?" he asked quietly. Nobody answered. Not immediately. Because suddenly fear had entered the room. Real fear. Richard forced a nervous laugh. "Sir, there's been some misunderstanding." Marcus cut him off sharply without even looking at him. "I wasn't speaking to you." That sentence hit Richard harder than any insult ever had. The room became unbearably still. Vanessa finally turned toward the diamond handbag display again. Then she spoke softly. "I believe your manager made me an offer." Marcus looked confused. "An offer?" Vanessa nodded calmly. "He said if I could afford this bag." She paused slightly before looking directly at Richard again. "He would quit." Richard's face lost color instantly. Because suddenly, for the very first time that night, he realized he might not know who Vanessa Cole really was. Richard Calloway felt the room slipping away from him. Not physically, but socially, psychologically. The kind of collapse that begins quietly inside a person before anyone else fully notices it. Moments earlier, he had been controlling the atmosphere of the store with confidence and sarcasm. Now the same employees who once laughed at his jokes were staring at him carefully, waiting to see what happened next. And Marcus Reed, the CFO of Laurent Global Holdings, was standing directly in front of Vanessa Cole with visible respect. Richard's mouth went dry. There's obviously some confusion here," he said quickly, forcing a smile that no longer looked natural. Marcus finally turned toward him. The disappointment in his expression was immediate. "What kind of confusion?" he asked quietly. Richard straightened his jacket nervously. "This customer came into the store without an appointment, and I was simply explaining our policies regarding premium inventory." Vanessa said nothing. She just watched him. That silence was becoming unbearable. Because every time Richard tried to regain control, Vanessa somehow made him sound smaller without speaking at all. Marcus glanced briefly toward Elena. Is that what happened? Elena froze. For years, employees inside Laurent Etoile had learned not to contradict Richard publicly. He controlled recommendations, schedules, promotions, even transfers. Speaking against him usually ended badly. But now, something had changed. Elena looked toward Vanessa for a moment. Vanessa gave no signal, no encouragement, no pressure, just calm observation, and somehow that made honesty easier. Elena swallowed carefully. No, sir. Richard turned toward her instantly. Elena, she didn't do anything wrong, Elena continued quickly, voice trembling slightly. Mr. Calloway started insulting her almost immediately. The room became still again. Marcus's eyes narrowed. Insulting. Richard laughed nervously. This is being exaggerated. But now another employee spoke up quietly from near the watches. He asked if she could afford the merchandise. Then another voice joined in and told her she was wasting everyone's time. Richard's chest tightened. Because once silence breaks, truth spreads fast. Marcus looked at Vanessa again. Is this accurate? Vanessa answered simply. Yes. No anger. No dramatic performance. Just truth. And somehow that was worse. Richard stepped forward desperately now. Sir, with respect, we deal with fraudulent visitors constantly. I made a judgment call based on experience. Marcus stared at him for several long seconds. Then asked quietly, based on what experience exactly? Richard hesitated, and that hesitation exposed everything. Because everyone in the room knew the answer already. Appearance, clothing, race, status assumptions. The invisible social calculations people pretend not to make. Marcus's expression hardened further. You publicly challenged Ms. Cole's ability to purchase merchandise. Richard tried forcing confidence back into his voice. It was harmless conversation. Vanessa finally spoke again. No, she said softly. It was humiliation. That sentence landed like a weight across the showroom. Richard opened his mouth immediately. That wasn't my intention, but you enjoyed it, Vanessa interrupted calmly. Silence. Complete silence. Because deep down, everyone knew she was right. Richard had enjoyed it. He enjoyed controlling people. He enjoyed deciding who belonged. He enjoyed making others feel smaller. Vanessa looked around the store slowly as she continued speaking. The interesting thing about power, she said quietly, is that people reveal themselves the moment they think someone beneath them can't fight back. Marcus lowered his eyes briefly. Several employees looked visibly uncomfortable. Even customers standing nearby had stopped pretending to browse. Richard felt panic beginning to replace arrogance now. Ms. Cole, he said carefully, if there has been any misunderstanding, I apologize. Vanessa looked at him. And for the first time that evening, there was disappointment in her expression. Not anger. Disappointment. That apology only exists because you think I matter now, she said softly. Richard froze. Because there was no defense against that. Vanessa took a slow step toward the center display where the diamond handbag rested beneath soft spotlighting. You were comfortable humiliating me when you believed I had no value to you. A pause. But now your tone has changed. Richard's breathing became uneven. Please, he said quietly, I didn't know who you were. Vanessa turned toward him immediately. And if I wasn't wealthy? She asked. No answer came. Because there wasn't one. The silence itself became the answer. Marcus looked visibly disturbed now. Not just professionally, but personally. He had worked with Vanessa Cole for years. He knew her history. Knew the empire she had built. Knew the reason she visited company locations anonymously across the country. She wasn't testing products. She was testing people. And tonight, people had failed. Vanessa glanced toward Elena briefly before looking back at Marcus. How long has this culture existed here? She asked calmly. Marcus looked toward the employees. Nobody spoke immediately. Then slowly, hands began rising. One employee, then another, then another. Richard stared around the room in disbelief. Employees he had managed for years suddenly looked unafraid. One woman near the register spoke first. "He treats customers differently based on appearance." Another employee nodded quickly. "And staff too." A third voice joined in. "We were told to prioritize people who looked wealthy." Richard's face drained completely now. Because this wasn't becoming a misunderstanding anymore. It was becoming exposure. Marcus's voice dropped lower. "Is any of this false?" Richard looked around desperately, searching for support. But nobody defended him, not one person. Because fear only survives while people remain isolated. And tonight, isolation had broken. Vanessa remained calm through all of it. That calmness terrified Richard more than shouting ever could have. Because she wasn't emotional. She was certain. And certainty is far more dangerous than anger. Finally, Richard looked directly at her. "What exactly do you want?" he asked quietly. Vanessa studied him for a long moment. Then answered with a softness that somehow felt devastating. "I wanted to buy a handbag." A few employees lowered their eyes immediately. Because now the cruelty of the situation felt undeniable. Richard had created this entire disaster himself. Not because Vanessa challenged him, but because he couldn't tolerate someone he viewed as lesser, existing comfortably in his space. Vanessa glanced once more at the luxury displays surrounding them. Then she said something that changed the entire atmosphere of the room again. "You know what the saddest part is?" Nobody answered. She continued quietly. "You never once saw me as a human being." And suddenly, Richard Calloway realized this night was no longer about losing his job. It was about losing the illusion he had built his entire identity around. The silence inside Laurent Etoile had changed completely now. Earlier, it had been the silence of entertainment. Curious customers watching a wealthy manager humiliate a woman he believed didn't belong. Now it was the silence of exposure. Heavy, uncomfortable, final. Richard Calloway stood near the center display trying desperately to hold himself together while the world around him quietly shifted against him. The confidence that once filled his posture had disappeared. His shoulders looked tighter now. Smaller. Every polished sentence he tried to form collapsed before reaching his mouth. Because for the first time in years, he no longer controlled the room. Vanessa Cole did, and she hadn't raised her voice once. Marcus Reed slowly removed his gloves and handed them to one of the security men standing near the entrance. His expression remained calm, but there was visible disappointment in his eyes now. Not just disappointment in Richard. Disappointment in the store, in the culture, in the truth being uncovered in front of customers and employees alike. "How long?" Marcus asked quietly. Richard blinked nervously. "Sir, how long has this behavior been happening?" Richard swallowed hard. But before he could answer, Elena spoke again. "For years." Richard turned toward her sharply. "Elena, enough." "No," she replied, surprising even herself. "Not enough." Her voice trembled slightly, but the fear inside it was finally breaking apart. "You embarrassed employees in front of customers," she continued. "You judged people before they even spoke. You told us appearances were everything." Other employees slowly nodded. One older saleswoman lowered her eyes. "We all knew it." Another whispered quietly, "We just didn't think anyone important would ever notice." That sentence lingered heavily in the air. Anyone important. Vanessa heard it too, and though her face barely changed, something moved behind her eyes. Because that sentence revealed the entire sickness underneath the situation. People believed kindness should depend on status. That respect should depend on money. That cruelty was acceptable as long as the victim seemed powerless. Vanessa slowly walked toward one of the large front windows overlooking the rain-soaked city outside. Her reflection shimmered faintly against the glass. Quiet, controlled, almost haunting. Marcus approached carefully. "Vanessa," she interrupted softly without turning around. "Do you know why I started doing anonymous visits?" Marcus remained silent. Vanessa answered her own question. Because board meetings lie. The room stayed completely still. Reports lie. Numbers lie. Corporate presentations lie. She glanced back slowly toward the employees. But ordinary moments reveal everything. A pause. You learn more about a company by watching how it treats one ignored person than by reading 10 years of profit statements. Elena felt chills run down her arms hearing that. Because suddenly Vanessa no longer seemed like just a billionaire. She seemed like someone who had spent years studying human nature itself. Richard tried again to recover the situation. Ms. Cole, please, if I crossed a line, I sincerely apologize. Vanessa turned toward him fully now. No, she said quietly. You regret consequences. The words hit with surgical precision. Richard opened his mouth again, but nothing came out. Because deep down, he knew she was right. Vanessa walked slowly back toward the center showroom while speaking calmly. When I entered this store tonight, nobody asked if I needed help. She looked toward the employees, not accusingly, but truthfully. They looked at my clothes, my shoes, my skin, then they decided my value. The room became painfully quiet again. And the saddest part, she continued softly, most of them probably didn't even realize they were doing it. Marcus lowered his head slightly. Even customers standing nearby looked uncomfortable now. Because everyone had participated somehow. Through laughter, through silence, through observation without intervention. Vanessa stopped beside the diamond handbag once more. This bag costs what? She asked calmly. Richard answered weakly. 280,000. Vanessa nodded slightly. Interesting. Then she looked directly at him again. You know what my mother used to make in a year cleaning hotel rooms? Nobody spoke. Vanessa's voice softened further. Less than the tax on this bag. That sentence transformed the atmosphere instantly. Because suddenly this wasn't just about luxury anymore. It was about memory, pain, class, survival. Richard stared at her uncertainly now, as though seeing her clearly for the first time. Vanessa continued. She spent 22 years cleaning rooms wealthy people destroyed in a single weekend. A pause. And people looked through her the exact same way you looked through me tonight. Elena felt tears sting her eyes unexpectedly. The employees remained motionless. Vanessa's calmness somehow made every word heavier. There's something dangerous about being underestimated for too long, she said quietly. Marcus looked at her carefully. Vanessa, but she continued, you start learning things. Her eyes slowly swept across the showroom. You learn who respects power. A pause. And who respects people. Silence swallowed the room again. Outside, thunder rolled faintly above the city skyline. Richard finally spoke in a weaker voice than anyone had ever heard from him. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Vanessa looked at him, for several long seconds, then asked softly, what exactly did you think would happen? That question broke something inside him. Because he had never actually thought that far. People like Richard rarely did. Cruelty becomes easy when consequences feel impossible. And for years, they had. But not tonight. Tonight, consequences had walked into the store wearing a rain-soaked coat and quiet eyes. Marcus stepped forward finally, his executive composure returning. Mr. Calloway, he said firmly, effective immediately, you are suspended pending formal investigation. Richard's face lost what little color remained. Marcus, please, this is no longer negotiable. The finality in his voice stunned the room. Richard looked around desperately. Nobody moved. Nobody defended him. Because the moment fear disappears, truth usually follows behind it. Vanessa quietly picked up the diamond handbag from the display. The entire store watched her. Then she handed it calmly to Elena. The young employee froze. What? Vanessa smiled faintly for the first time that night. Wrap it, please. Elena stared at her in shock. Because suddenly everyone in the store understood something horrifying for Richard Calloway. Vanessa Cole hadn't just been able to afford the handbag. She probably could have bought the entire building without checking her bank account first. Elena's hands trembled as she carefully accepted the handbag from Vanessa. For a moment, she genuinely forgot how to move. Not because of the price of the bag. Not because one mistake had just destroyed a manager's career. But because the atmosphere inside Laurent Etoile no longer felt like a luxury store. It felt like Judgment Day. Every employee stood frozen behind polished counters while customers watched in complete silence. Nobody cared about shopping anymore. The entire building had become consumed by one terrifying realization. They had all witnessed a powerful woman being treated as worthless, simply because she looked ordinary. And now the consequences were unfolding in real time. Elena swallowed carefully before asking in a quiet voice, "Would you like it gift-wrapped, Ms. Cole?" Vanessa looked at her gently. "Yes," she replied. "Please." Unlike Richard, Vanessa's kindness felt natural, unforced, calm, and somehow that made the contrast even more painful. Richard stood several feet away, looking as though he could barely breathe. His expensive suit suddenly seemed meaningless on him now. The authority he once carried had evaporated so completely that even his posture looked unfamiliar. Marcus stepped beside him quietly. "I need your store keys." Richard blinked. "Marcus, the keys." The room remained silent while Richard slowly reached into his pocket. The tiny metallic sound of the keys hitting Marcus's palm echoed far louder than it should have. Because everyone understood what it meant. Power leaving someone's hands. For the first time in 15 years, Richard Calloway no longer belonged at the center of Laurent Etoile. And he knew it. His eyes drifted toward Vanessa again. She wasn't even looking at him anymore. That hurt more than the suspension itself. Because humiliation is one thing. Irrelevance is another. Vanessa had already emotionally moved past him. Richard suddenly spoke again, desperation cracking through his voice now. "Ms. Cole, please." The entire room looked toward him. Vanessa turned slowly. "I made a mistake," he continued quickly. "I judged you unfairly. I understand that now." Vanessa studied him carefully. "No," she said softly. "You understand consequences now." That sentence landed harder than any public insult could have. Richard's breathing became uneven. "I can change." Vanessa nodded slightly. "I hope you do." The calmness of her answer shattered him even further. Because he realized something horrifying in that moment. She wasn't interested in revenge. And when someone powerful refuses revenge, it forces you to sit alone with yourself instead. Richard lowered his eyes. For years he had believed success came from controlling people, impressing wealthy clients, protecting elite environments from those he viewed as beneath them. But now, standing in front of Vanessa Cole, he suddenly understood how fragile that entire identity really was. One assumption, one sentence, one arrogant moment, that was all it took to destroy it. Meanwhile, Elena carefully wrapped the handbag behind the counter, still struggling to process what was happening. As she folded the luxury packaging carefully, she glanced toward Vanessa again. "You really came here alone?" she asked quietly before she could stop herself. Vanessa smiled faintly. "I usually do." Elena frowned slightly. "Why?" The question hung gently in the air. Vanessa looked around the store slowly before answering. "Because people behave differently when they think nobody important is watching." That sentence hit nearly every employee in the room, especially the ones who had stayed silent earlier. Vanessa noticed their expressions immediately. Then she said something unexpected. "Silence doesn't always come from cruelty." The employees looked at her carefully. "Sometimes," she continued softly, "people stay quiet because they're afraid." Elena lowered her eyes. Because that was true too. Vanessa walked slowly toward the front entrance while rain continued pouring outside the glass doors. Marcus followed beside her. "The board will demand immediate restructuring after this." Vanessa nodded calmly. "Good. You're not angry." That question made Vanessa pause. For the first time all night, she looked genuinely tired. Not physically, Emotionally. There was a time, she said quietly, when moments like this destroyed me. Marcus remained silent. Vanessa looked out toward the storm-covered city. But eventually, she continued, you realize something. A pause. People only reveal what already exists inside them. Marcus understood immediately. Richard hadn't suddenly become cruel tonight. Tonight had simply exposed what had always been there. Vanessa glanced back toward the employees one last time. You can teach people sales techniques, she said softly. You can teach presentation, branding, negotiation. Then her eyes settled briefly on Richard. But you cannot teach someone to value another human being. The room fell silent again. Because deep down, everyone knew she was right. Elena approached carefully with the finished package in her hands. Vanessa accepted it politely. Then Elena surprised herself by speaking again. I'm sorry, she whispered. Vanessa tilted her head slightly. For what? For not saying something sooner. Vanessa's expression softened almost invisibly. You did eventually, she replied gently. And somehow that small kindness nearly brought Elena to tears. Because people rarely realize how powerful mercy feels after fear. Marcus moved toward the doors, preparing security outside. But before Vanessa stepped out into the rain, she suddenly stopped. Then she turned back toward Richard one final time. The entire showroom became still again. Richard looked up slowly. Vanessa's voice remained calm. When you looked at me tonight. A pause. What exactly did you see? Richard opened his mouth, but no answer came, because for the first time in his life, he understood how ugly the real answer sounded out loud. Vanessa nodded slightly. That, she said softly, is the real problem. Then she turned and walked toward the doors. And as the rainstorm swallowed the city outside, Richard Calloway realized something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The most powerful woman he had ever met was also the one he had treated like she mattered least. The front doors of Laurent Etoile closed softly behind Vanessa Cole as she stepped back into the rain. For several seconds, nobody inside the store moved. It was as though the building itself had stopped breathing. Employees stood frozen behind display counters. Customers remained scattered across the showroom pretending to look at watches and handbags they no longer cared about. Even the soft piano music overhead suddenly felt distant and uncomfortable. Because the illusion had shattered. And once people witness truth clearly, they can never fully return to pretending they didn't see it. Richard Calloway remained standing near the center display like a man abandoned inside his own life. His tie hung slightly loose now. Sweat glistened faintly near his forehead despite the cold air conditioning inside the store. 15 years of carefully constructed authority had collapsed within less than an hour. And the worst part wasn't losing the job. It was realizing everyone had seen who he truly was before he could hide it again. Marcus Reed slowly turned toward the employees gathered nearby. I want written statements from everyone before tomorrow morning, he said firmly. Nobody argued. Nobody hesitated. The fear Richard once controlled no longer belonged to him. That realization hollowed him out even further. Marcus, he said quietly, please. We can handle this internally. Marcus looked at him with visible disbelief. Internally. Richard swallowed hard. I've built this location into one of the highest performing stores in the company. Marcus's expression hardened immediately. And you thought that excused this? Richard opened his mouth again. Then stopped. Because deep down, he knew performance had become his shield for years. As long as profits remained high, nobody looked too closely at behavior. Vanessa understood that. Which was exactly why she visited anonymously. Marcus stepped closer. You know what your biggest mistake was tonight? He asked quietly. Richard stared at him helplessly. Marcus answered before he could speak. You assumed dignity belongs only to people with money. The words struck harder than Richard expected. Because suddenly the entire evening became horrifyingly simple. Everything he had said, everything he implied, every sarcastic smile, every judgment, All of it traced back to that one ugly belief. Nearby, Elena remained behind the counter organizing paperwork with trembling hands. Her emotions were still catching up to what had happened. Hours earlier she had been terrified of saying the wrong thing around Richard. Now he looked powerless, human, fragile. The transformation felt unreal. One older employee suddenly spoke quietly from near the register. She knew from the beginning. Everyone looked toward her. What? The woman shook her head slowly. She knew exactly what he was doing from the moment she walked in. Silence followed, because now that truth seemed obvious. Vanessa hadn't reacted emotionally because she